Today, the bear in the china shop with Tarric Brooker. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, one that is post covering finance and property news Friday, and Tarric is with me once again. Hi Tarric.
G'day Martin, how are you mate?
Yeah, I'm very good, and I thought we'd call this show The Bear in the China Shop, because of course we're going to focus in on China. And I think we're right to be a little bearish about what's going on in China.
Yeah, I think we are, and I think it's just about the perspective on that bearishness and where that's stemming from a very Australian perspective, and that's something that we've got a lot of comments on. We've got a lot of tweets about. People have asked us, how reliant is Australia on China? In what way is it reliant? And how connected are we to the broader Chinese economy? So, with a very long set of slides today, we are going to get through that in hopefully a relatively timely fashion.
Well, we'll see. I guess there's a couple of interesting observations. One is that internationally, Australia has been seen as a proxy for investing in China. And that's something to bear in mind because, of course, if that changes, then that could actually have a very significant impact. And the other is, of course, that in recent weeks, we've seen many, quote, initiatives in China trying to prop up the economy, but it feels to me like they're sort of throwing a little bit of mud at the wall and hoping it's going to stick, rather than the sort of the size and shape of the support that we got from the Chinese through the global financial crisis. So there's something different going along in China this time around.
100%. Like normally the Chinese playbook during the financial crisis, and then again to a slightly lesser extent during the pandemic, was property and infrastructure, and just absolutely throwing the kitchen sink at it. But what we've seen more recently, especially even in the last 72 hours, is we've seen cuts to Chinese income taxes. We've seen cuts to mortgage rates for existing borrowers, and that's something that we haven't seen since 2008. So it's, a very, very different set of circumstances, various different cuts by the People's Bank of China to encourage credit. And the People's Bank of China has also ordered banks in some locales to basically pretend that property investors are first home buyers when they are assessed for loans. So that's something that probably we'll see explored here in Australia at some point.
What could possibly go wrong? Well, bearing in mind the number of slides we've got and the things we want to cover, let's get straight into it, shall we?
Yeah, sure. Okay, as usual, the slides will be available at avidcom.substack.com. Generally, unless the slides are labeled, they are by me or they are sourced in a caption below. So if you want to go support or look at some of the great slides that we've got today, feel free. If you would like to support my appearances on DFA or my content, you can do so at avidcom.substack.com. You can subscribe, you can make a one-off donation. All help is very, very much appreciated. So we'll get it right into your questions. Now, the first question that we're going to be covering is basically by what mechanism is Australia reliant on China? And basically, Australia is very, very much a resources-driven economy. Now, like over 50% of our exports are either resource-related, so minerals, iron ore, coal, coking coal, gas, copper, gold, you name it. That is Australia's bread and butter for exports. So that makes Australia very, very reliant on global commodity cycles. And as the biggest importer of commodities, reliant by extension on China, and we'll get exactly into the exact details of that in just a few slides.
Yeah, and I think it's important to stress that, there's a lot of debate about the nature of the Australian economy, but it is a very distorted economy. The old mantra of houses and holes, right? So basically we spend a lot of our time building stuff, particularly property, but the other rest of it is we're digging stuff out and shipping it overseas. And we've got a very narrow-based economy. I think on some international measures, we're sort of down with some African countries in terms of the breadth of the Australian economy, because frankly, we're all about digging stuff up and chucking it overseas.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, that is really just the bread and butter. Like as you said, it's the bread and butter of our economy. It's basically we have a housing market, we have a construction sector, and that is basically propped up in terms of the value of our currency and inflows by our mining and resources sector. Take either of those pillars that holding up the economy away, and you're going to have a bad time.
And that's why, of course, the focus on the property sector is explained, because, of course, it's a huge part of what we do and financial stability. But why also, as we'll see, what happens in China is probably as significant in Australia as almost anywhere in the world.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think, it's just worth pointing out that we are not reliant on the broader Chinese economy. There are parts of the Chinese economy right now that are booming, that could continue to boom well into the future. But those elements, say, for example, like a booming Chinese elements of the services sector, tourism, high-end, restaurants, that sort of thing, you could see a boom in China, but Australia doesn't really benefit from that all that much. If the property sector continues to fall apart, then we will see a whole lot more downside than we will see upside, even if the rest of the Chinese economy performs very well.
Yeah, absolutely. Narrow-based, high risk.
Yeah. Now, this is from the Minerals Council, and it's based on an estimate. So I would take it with a pinch of salt in that regard, but it is the most updated estimate I could find. And basically, it shows that during the 2021-2022 financial year, Australian governments got over $60 billion worth of revenue from the mining sector. Now, that's up from around about $15 billion in 2015. So the whole, surplus and everything else that gets crowed about and, all of the various windfalls Australia's experienced, it's not because of government skill or positive management or all those narratives that have been trotted out by both sides of politics over the last 15 or 20 years. A lot of the time, it's just the fact that Lady Luck has once again dropped a bounty in our lap. And, we've just got lucky again.
Yeah, plus, of course, the other big factor is the sort of sneaky moves with regard to the tax rates in Australia, if you look at personal income tax. So basically, two things have actually supported the so-called surplus. One is this data here, and the other is that income tax takes are higher because of the rates not being effectively linked to inflation. And in fact, households are spending more and more of their income supporting the economy via the tax system than almost ever.
Yeah, it's quite a shocking set of facts, actually, and that's something that's been happening for a long, long time. It's not something that's that's just been since the pandemic. It's something that's been deteriorating for a number of years under the Albanese government more recently, but also the coalition for quite a long time. But I think this windfall that Australia enjoys from something that's worth almost 3% of GDP that just basically drops in our lap is something that supports the strength of the Australian sovereign in terms of our borrowing capacity, but it's also something that supports our ability to go out and spend as a nation on various projects, on various policies, and basically backstops that ability. Now, if we were to see a severe deterioration in the revenue that we derive from our resources sector, and I will note that this is just mining alone, if we were to see, for example, a big drop-off in the value of coking coal, in the value of iron ore, which are, depending on the year in question, Australia's two largest exports, we would see a very, very different set of papers from the Treasury.
Absolutely. It goes back to what I said, that there's a narrow base on which the economy works. And, I have to say that I get quite frustrated when I hear about the expert management of the economy from the politicians, of either flavour, right? I mean, it's frankly, it's BS. Basically, they are fortunate because money's piling in their lap, which gives them the ability to spend stuff and to do stuff, but it doesn't actually take much skill to do what they're doing. And in fact, they're not necessarily tackling the critical issues, the long-term strategic issues. They're just saying, gimme, gimme, gimme.
Yeah, exactly. And that's something that is worth noting just on this chart. Now, this is Australia's trade balance. And basically, since the start of 2018, Australia has been running a trade surplus. Now, that has been largely derived from the run-up in commodity prices, but also the rise of the LNG sector, which has occurred relatively quickly. Australia has, has risen very swiftly to become, depending on the year in question, the largest exporter of LNG in the world. And that inflow, that, sort of 10 to sort of $18 billion a month that is additionally flowing into Australia. Now, it is worth noting that there is some very strong research to suggest that this number is wrong because of how Australia calculates our education sector exports, which is something that I might get you to link the article by Cameron Murray in the description below. But suffice to say, Australia gets a very large amount of inflows, and that helps support the value of the Australian dollar. Now, if you were to take those inflows away and replace it with a trade deficit, and have obviously the other side of the coin is going to be the reduced levels of government revenue, you're then going to have upward pressure on inflation due to a weaker currency, and that's going to put pressure on the RBA in a really quite challenging sort of set of circumstances where the government is looking to tighten its belt and to be a little bit more frugal because of the potential drop-off in revenue in this scenario, but then also faces the potential for importing inflation as the paradigm shifts.
Yeah, and it is worth, I think, highlighting that the LNG price, of course, went very high over the last year or so, partly because of the turning off the taps from Russia in Europe. Plus, of course, the fact that because of the very high LNG prices, gas for Australians are also very high, because effectively Australia is exposed through the way that the mechanism works to very high gas prices, which actually then flows through into very high energy prices. So this is a bit of a dual-edged sword in terms of the fact that it puts higher pressures on cost of living, thanks to the fact that effectively those international corporations that actually run the gas system are basically holding Australia to ransom in terms of the prices that they actually charge.
Yeah, that's just worth just a little side note just about the monthly inflation figures and the cost of energy. If not for the energy subsidies, you'd be looking at, inflation being at least 0.3% higher year on year, a whole hell of a lot higher month on month. And I will also just point out one other little thing just about the inflation figures. This month didn't count council rates. Now, anyone who's picked up their council rates notice for July and gone, wow, some people have seen, 20, 30, even 40% increases in council rates. Now, admittedly, there are caps in some states, but those caps have been raised. So the contribution to inflation by council rates and property rates more broadly is going to go up. And that's also something that's going to feed into the quarterly figure, which didn't feed into the monthly one. So it's going to be an interesting one in that regard.
And just one other quick thing on the inflation numbers. You may have noticed the reweighting that was done this month, right? Which effectively meant that the costs of international travel and transport was actually lifted as a weighting of the total. And guess what? That number came down. So the reweighting that they did out of cycle actually put downward pressure on the overall inflation number too. So there's a bit of number wagging going on here.
Yeah, and I think it's just worth noting that part of the issue as well is that the ABS has serious issues with holiday travel seasonality. Yeah. It's a big problem. They've said it's a big problem. They said basically take all this with a very, very large grain of salt, which admittedly their warnings and their concerns gets sort of pushed away. And I have a feeling that come December, when we see the big seasonal surge in holiday travel costs again, as we have over the last couple of years, a lot of people are going to be shocked by that, only to find that the following year, that when everything drops off again, that everyone's going to be celebrating how disinflationary everything is all over again, even though it wasn't actually inflationary. It was really all that inflationary in the first place. It's just broken seasonality the ABS is struggling to understand. And, that's admittedly, it's a very, very challenging task.
No, it is challenging. And of course, we've got the rental issue where, in fact, the rental surveys that they use, and it's quite a detailed survey now, includes all rents, not just new rents, whereas the CoreLogic reporting is actually more on new rents. So there's another catch-up question there as well. Yeah,
I mean, the RBA reckons that the rental component's going to at least 10%. I think that we're probably going to see north of that realistically, but I mean, because the RBA tends to be conservative on these sorts of things. But I mean, even if we just reach, the core logic figure, and we don't even get anywhere near the domain and SQM levels, which is sort of like 20 to 25% in some cases, I think that, that's still going to be a pretty rough sort of thing to navigate. And, and not only that, but we also, the issue with the electricity prices as well is that's baked in basically for the next 12 months. So, trying to get inflation under control before, sort of July, August, 2024 is going to be rough.
Yeah, it's certainly going to be a challenge. But anyway, let's get back to the China question. But I think it was really important just to set that inflation context in this discussion, because it's such a critical issue against which, of course, all the decisions are going to be taken. But this trade question, particularly with China, is going to drive a lot of those decisions.
Yeah, and exactly. I mean, with the Australian dollar in such a vulnerable place already, that is going to be a key factor going forward, because if the China trade does drop off and the Australian economy weakens at the same time, that's going to put the RBA in a very, very challenging place. And that's something that even we've seen recently. People like Christopher Joy's mentioned, and even the likes of CBA have said, we risk basically a Pacific peso moment once again.
And just to be clear on that, the reason that's critical is that if the exchange rate drops significantly, then, as you said earlier on, we actually import a lot more inflation, because international goods like oil are just more expensive in local currency terms, and that's a big deal. Exactly,
and that's one of the reasons why we've seen a 1 year high in the cost of fuel, the cost of petrol at the Bowser recently.
Yep.
And that's something that's going to hurt. That's something that's going to put upward pressure on inflation later in the year if that current trend continues.
Yeah, and just to finish on the inflation, the petroleum costs didn't show in the latest monthly numbers because it was a bit delayed, but it will next month. And so that's going to be another reason why my view is we're going to see inflation probably coming across and then going higher as we go into the second half of the year.
Well, that has been the experience in Europe and the US, so it's going to be interesting to watch.
Indeed.
Okay, now, people say sometimes, well, can't we just find somewhere else to sell our iron ore to? And the answer is, well, technically yes, but realistically no. China buys up 70% of the world's iron ore exports for itself. So attempting to find another customer to sell it to is basically, it's literally impossible with the current sort of paradigm and the current settings. Now, I'm just going to go to the next slide. So China imports 70% of it. Australia produces 53% of it. So basically, when it comes to iron ore, Australia's the only game in town. But when it comes to the people who want to buy it, China's the only game in town. So Australia is basically entirely reliant on China in that regard. It's not like we can just sell it to another up and coming nation who could make up the shortfall in any meaningful way.
Now that's a very astonishing piece of data, isn't it? To show just how one country and another country are so connected, and it's so critical. So the critical then question becomes, so is it likely that China is going to consume as much iron ore in the months and years ahead? Which of course then takes us into all of these questions about, so what is China doing? They had this big building boom post 2008 and built lots of properties and built a lot of transportation, which needed a lot of iron ore. But what if China's strategy this time is less demanding of those iron ore supplies? And what do we do with all that stuff that we're digging up and shipping out if we can't find somebody else to buy it?
Exactly. And I think one of the things that is worth noting in all this is that Australia is basically the lowest cost iron ore producer on Earth, on average, by a very, very large margin. Now, there are a lot of other iron ore producers. There is even some in Africa that are expected to be absolutely enormous and rival Australia in terms of, production capacity in the long term. But realistically, Australia's is cheap. And we also have the relative proximity to China in terms of shipping thousands over 1 billion tons of iron ore globally, which is, roughly what you're talking about in terms of overall imports, is a lot. And that proximity helps Australia. And I think that's just one of the things in all this. There's this sort of doomsday scenario in which, China goes down, Australia is going to completely go down, and that's going to be the end of it. We're basically going to become a banana republic, third world country. Now, is that possible? Yes. If it's horrifically badly mismanaged by the government, which is admittedly possible. But realistically, Australia still has all of these resources. We are still going to be selling probably maybe not in terms of iron ore, but we're probably going to be selling almost as much, if not, and in terms of other things, probably just as much in a lot of different cases. But realistically, we are going to be putting all these other producers around the world out of business because ours is cheap, but we're going to be getting a whole lot lower price for it if, the sort of China property into oblivion scenario was to play out.
Yeah, and two other factors on China and iron ore. One is that they're focusing in very much on recycling the iron that's already in China, which is a big change from where it was. And secondly, they've been investing very big in some African countries to try and actually source iron ore from alternatives to Australia. And so those two things, and at the moment the economics don't necessarily work, but they could work later possibly. And so, those factors are just worth thinking about. So what is China's appetite for iron ore going to be, and where are they going to source it becomes a very critical question, not just for China, but also for Australia.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, if we do see a scenario, say, for example, we just sort of tread water and things remain relatively status quo for another decade, if we do see China develop these mines, in particularly in West Africa, that do, talking about some of these mines can produce, 250, 300 million tons of iron ore a year, that is going to put Australia in a very tight spot. And we've seen that Beijing is willing to use punitive trade actions on Australia in order to try and get what it wants. And for the moment, things like coking coal and iron ore have been sacred cows that they haven't wanted to touch. But that's because they have no leverage. We are the only game in a lot of ways, we are the only game in town, or the market's not large enough for them to be able to throw their weight around. But if that changes because of developments of production in Africa or elsewhere, they might be quite a little bit more inclined to throw their weight around and to try and hit Australia where it hurts.
Absolutely, just at the time when potentially the Australian economy could be quite vulnerable.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's sort of a bit Machiavellian, but it's on message.
Yeah.
Now, this is of metallurgical coal consumption globally. And as you can see, again, China is basically, once again, the king, unsurprisingly. And we'll just, for a bit more context, this is a map of exporters. And as you can see, Australia is, once again, by far the largest exporter, but it doesn't actually export that much these days to China. It exports to India, it exports to Japan, to South Korea. But this is where I think things get interesting. China actually produces a lot of coking coal. And while it does import a fairly sizable proportion, a fairly sizable amount, if we do see a severe deterioration in the Chinese property sector and a continued falls in the level of steel production, back towards sort of more, shall we say, more normal levels, then China is going to have all this spare coking coal capacity, and in a lot of cases at a price that's either competitive with or cheaper than Australia's own capacity. So that gives them the potential ability to compete with us and to then sell into the broader market, which would then, while China may not suffer that much in that regard, it's going to put Australia in a position where we're going to have to accept lower prices for our coking coal if that sort of property doomsday scenario is realized.
Yeah, and it's just worth underscoring again that there are two parameters. One is volume and the other is price, right? And those two things are just worth wrapping our heads around, because effectively you can increase the value by just shipping more stuff out. But if it's a lower price, you don't get as much as if it's a higher price. On the other hand, if prices are really high, then it's a different equation. And I think sometimes some of the mainstream miss the difference between the volume and the price lever, which is a critical thing to understand.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like, at the moment, coking coal prices are still well elevated above where they were prior. So are thermal coal prices. And that's something, going forward that's going to be a really challenging issue, especially as more and more countries try and become self-sufficient in these elements because of geopolitical issues and and the like, and even just sort of that they want to be able to insulate themselves against whatever plays out in around the world. And that's something that we've increasingly seen since the the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing I just want to highlight is that the international flows here are still quite complex. And we are, of course, now going through a significant geopolitical re-shifting of the pieces. If you go back a decade, it was all about globalization and collaboration and lowest cost production. It seems to me that the map of the world is changing now because effectively there's the realignment, the BRICS and the Western realignment, and also the question of wanting to make sure that we don't have all our eggs in one basket. So I think the reversal of globalization is another factor to sort of throw into this story here, because to my mind, the trade flows over the next decade could be quite different for the ones that we've seen over the last couple of decades.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think that we often see these narratives put forward that Australia is going to be one of the beneficiaries of deglobalization and the bifurcation of global supply chains, and I would say the duplication of global supply chains, because there are certain rare earths where China controls 60, 70, 80, 90, even 100% of the world's entire production. And they're key to manufacturing everything from smartphones to smart bombs. And we are seeing the Western world, Europe, and the US in particular, looking to places like Australia to develop their own supply chains for these key minerals. And I think that that's going to be something that's going to benefit Australia handsomely in the years to come. And that's something that I'm actually quite positive about going, for the 10, 20, 30 years into the future. But I think we also then need to accept that if we are going to see this bifurcation of global supply chains and deglobalization, that then our bulk commodity exports are likely to suffer as well as our export locales, whether it's India or China or whoever tries to become more self-sufficient and tries to source more stuff for them locally. So, for example, one of the ways that China's doing that with coking coal is sourcing a greater amount from places like Mongolia, where they can get it much, much closer, and from a place that's a whole lot more secure in terms of the long-term supply issues. I mean, there is sort of, the nightmare scenario for China is that the US turns to Australia and says, well, we're going to help you out with a bit of, sort of cash on the side here, and you just stop selling your iron ore to the Chinese. Now, that's an absolutely sort of, nuclear level scenario, but when you're a policymaker, it's something that you do have to consider.
Well, certainly, and Australia's strong alignment with the US does actually contrast the political influence versus the trade influence, right? So Australia's got these sort of two forces pulling in very different directions. And as you say, if the US starts, influencing directly or indirectly political trajectory in Australia against China, it's going to be very hard for Australia to resist that, which means we're sort of caught between these two global poles, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, it's the old, when two elephants fight, it's the grass who suffers, And in this, we are the grass.
Yeah, that probably explains it. And that probably explains some of the mountains of poo around the place too.
Pretty much. Okay, now this is of coking coal exports, and that basically just illustrates, similar to the iron ore picture, that Australia is heavily reliant on this stuff, and we are really the global center for the exports of these key minerals, and that really we don't have a whole lot of choice who we send them to. We've just got to just deal with it. And And I think that sort of really just somewhat exposes Australia as a price taker and not a price setter. We can't turn around and just go, oh, well, no, we're not going to sell it to you for that price. We really just have to wear it. And, we've seen that in past commodity cycles where coal and gas prices have just absolutely collapsed.
Yeah, and I will just make another point. It seems to me that China is often quite okay playing the long-term game as well. So, they seem to have, maybe it's their central planning mentality, but they seem to be thinking, well, strategically longer term, what are the moves that we need to make? And so in the short term, they might be comfortable paying the higher prices, but in the background, they'll be looking for levers they can pull to reduce those prices, as we saw earlier on with steel, investing in Africa and those sorts of things. So that there is a complex set of dynamics in China and a long-term view that I think sometimes we in Australia don't necessarily sort of get on the page on.
No, I think you're right. I think that there is that sort of that planning, and I think the thing as well is that that's not something that's unique to China as well. I mean, that's something that we're even starting to see in particular in places like India, where with Prime Minister Modi's made in India drive, and it's really I find it really quite interesting just because you've got these two major developing nations, two major drivers of global growth, and they're both pushing in a direction of one, there's the renewables factor, and two, there's just the self-sufficiency factor, and neither one of those things really benefit us.
That's right. And of course, it's interesting that India and China are part of BRICS. And of course, they had that South African meeting the other day. Russia sort of video conferenced in, well, at least Putin did, but they obviously represent on the ground too. And I thought it was quite an interesting meeting. In fact, I made a show last week about it, and it's got quite a lot of views because I was trying to argue that, there's an interesting set of developments here. Remember that BRICS started more as an investment bankers thought about where the future investments might be in high growth economies rather than a power block, but it's sort of morphing into a power block. And of course, they introduced some other potential players, particularly those oil producers. So the BRICS story is also part of this story too, it seems to me.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting, just to see how it evolves going forward, how the cooperation evolves, and I think for the moment it's a very loose group of people, basically getting together and sort of, just saying, well, what suits your interests that suits my interests. But I think as it evolves, it's going to be interesting to see, and as it sort of becomes a more, shall we say, cohesive, structure, it's going to be interesting to see, the levels of friction that we see between existing rivals, say, for example, China and India, or Iran and Saudi Arabia, as the sort of normal diplomatic and geopolitical tit for tat ends up in impacting it, but also just how they could potentially work together on certain things and, develop strategies to, become perhaps less reliant on, the traditional power blocks.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of the talk was about multilateralism and not being just beholden to the Western sort of corner of the world, as it were, in terms of strategy and economics. So it'll be interesting to just play out. I mean, in my view, it's not going to mean the end of the dollar tomorrow, but it does actually signal, I think, significant divergence in terms of political thinking and economic power bases going ahead, which again leads to more complexity for everybody trying to navigate this interesting world that we're in.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I mean, personally, I think that the dollar's probably going to be around longer than most people think it will, mostly just because there isn't really an alternative. But I think the rise of the potential longer term rise of a multipolar world is an interesting one, because usually what happens when the world ends up in a multipolar situation is that the poles collide and things don't tend to end well.
Exactly. Yep. Different interests, and people actually then take one side or the other side and then start throwing rocks and then perhaps other things that are more destructive.
Yeah, pretty much. Alrighty. Now, this, I think, is a good way of looking at things. Now, if we imagine that one side of the scale is Chinese steel production, and on the other side, we have Chinese steel demand. Now, what we've seen so far is that demand for Chinese steel from property has dropped by roughly around about 16%. Now, I'm basing that on the level of construction activity, so it's a bit of a proxy, so it's a little bit of a rubbery figure in that regard. But until we get more updated figures from various statistics bodies in China, it's going to have to do. But housing starts are down by around 50%. So there's still a long way for that to fall in terms of Chinese activity, in terms of Chinese property sector activity. So basically what's happened so far is we've seen about, that demand come off, but we've seen it replaced by various levels of Chinese government spending on infrastructure. And that has managed to, sort of not stop demand and stop steel production from falling, but it has managed to stop it falling precipitously. Now, the issue going forward is as demand for steel from the property sector continues to fall, then they're going to have to replace that demand with something else. And that, I think, is really the challenge for them maintaining what I like to call the glide path down for the Chinese property sector and the broader economy. Because if they can't maintain that balancing act, then the whole thing topples over and things get more challenging.
Yeah, and the balancing act, of course, is being precipitated partly by what households in China want to do and can do. And, the property owning sector in China has been a significant leverage point, but will it be? Plus, of course, the fact that in China, they're now trying to actually find alternative growth models, which is less about just building stuff and exporting it cheaply overseas, but actually trying to make an economy that's based on perhaps some more consumption. And then we've also got the sort of the mentality coming out of China to say, well, we want to have a little bit more equality across, so share the wealth a bit as well. So all of those things are in the background here, which suggests that this balance is going to be very difficult to actually architect.
Yeah, exactly. And that, I think, is really I think this is a nice illustration of how challenging that's going to be. Now, new real estate starts have dropped by 56% in China, and the amount under construction has only dropped by 16%. Now, the reason why this is because obviously when you're talking about these big apartment buildings and these complexes that are the size of suburbs in some cases, it takes time to get them approved. It takes time. So there's this pipeline of existing projects that's been basically helping the Chinese property sector tread water and help support demand for Australian bulk commodities like iron ore, like coking coal over the last couple of years, that we have seen this big hit to the Chinese property sector. But the question becomes, eventually the black line and the green line are going to meet each other. The question is where. And if it's meeting that together down towards the bottom of that chart, that's a lot of steel capacity that is going to go sitting there doing nothing, and a whole lot more Australian iron ore and coking coal that's going to have to be sold at a significantly lower price, unless somehow the Chinese government manages to find a way to maintain that production by throwing the kitchen sink at, say, for example, infrastructure construction. But so far, they don't really seem all that willing to do that, because they have noted in the past that there's not even diminishing returns, just negative net returns on a lot of these projects that they've spent, over time, trillions of dollars on.
Yeah, and it is interesting also to ask what the vacant capacity is in property, because we know that there are a lot of projects that are half finished, but they're not really progressing them. We also know that there's a lot of property in some areas that is just empty. Sort of standing there in splendid isolation. And also, of course, occasionally you get to the point where they start demolishing it rather than actually completing it.
That's a good point. And I think it's just worth noting that even if you look at things, say, from China's own government statistics bureau, the National Bureau of Statistics for China, their own projections show that demand for new property peaked in, I believe it was 2017 or 2018, and is basically going to continue to fall precipitously from here over the entire length of the forward estimates, which I believe was like the next 20 years, because Chinese demographics are not good. you have a contracting population, you have a contracting working age population of these people who can actually afford to go out and buy properties. And it's also the fact that Chinese property prices in a lot of places, even in Chinese low-tier cities, they're looking at similar price to income ratios as Sydney or New York or London. Yes, and if you're looking at sort of tier one cities, places like Shanghai or Beijing and places like that, you're looking at 2.5 times the price to income ratio that you see in Sydney. So it's a pretty challenging set of circumstances.
Yeah, and in fact, a lot of the property demand was supported by Chinese people holding multiple properties. So it's an interesting distribution question, right? So you've got some people like in Australia, in China, holding multiple properties, other people not being able to necessarily get access to it. But that demographic shift that you've spoken about is huge, and it's probably one of the most significant factors which will determine the future shape and size of the economy in China. And by the way, I think India's now, hasn't it? Has it just overtaken it? China in terms of total population? I believe so.
Yeah, it has indeed. And no, you make a very good point about the speculative side of Chinese property and Chinese property demand in particular, because there was an interesting study done a couple of years ago. I believe it was by Kenneth Rogoff. Really fascinating stuff. And basically, it concluded that as of 2018, around 70% of new Chinese property was being bought by someone who already had one or more properties. So basically, it was being bought by property investors. And then on the other side of the coin, you've got President Xi and the Chinese Communist Party saying houses are not for speculation; they are for living in. So basically, you're left with this really challenging situation whereby 70% of property is flowing to investors, yet you also have this mechanism in China whereby property turnover is glacial. You're not allowed to sell property for too much of a discount in a lot of places because it would be, un-Chinese or whatever other nonsense that the government comes out with. So you're stuck with this scenario whereby there is a world in which Chinese property prices fall far enough that people do go out and do go buy homes, and maybe things turn out quite a little bit better than things would suggest. But that would require a housing crash. So it's really quite interesting in that regard that in a lot of ways they've shot themselves in the foot.
Yeah, and the most recent announcements about relaxing, they've actually basically sort of changed some of the parameters, particularly in the investment sector, to effectively allow those investors to get cheaper rates for the properties that they might want to buy. So they're pulling in two directions at the same time again.
They are, and it makes you wonder. Are they just doing it to create what is basically just bag holders because they want to create a glide path, as I said, for the Chinese property sector, keep the plate spinning just long enough to just sort of, deflate it in the most manageable way possible? I mean, the Chinese goal isn't really to sort of have prices fall. What they want to do is have prices stay the same magically and then have incomes catch up with where prices are. Now, for them to catch up in any meaningful way, we're going to be waiting probably the best part of the next 50 years in terms of catching up with where they need to be in some of the more the really expensive cities. But I don't know. I don't really see it being realistic. You can't deflate. You can't maintain a bubble. I mean, it's like the chart I showed in last fortnight's show, where basically a lot of Chinese, according to private data providers, a lot of Chinese cities have already had a housing crash. It's just the fact that you're not allowed to, they're not allowed to say that in terms of the more official statistics.
And just a sidebar, that the concept of keeping prices high but not rising and letting incomes catch up, I think is probably quite close to what the strategy might be in Australia too, because they can't afford to let property prices fall, because if they did, the banks would get into terrible trouble, people would lose confidence and all those things. But you have to be waiting a long time for incomes to catch up to where prices currently are in both countries.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's really interesting in Australia. But I don't think it's possible myself.
No.
I think Australian property prices, they either, on a sort of more, say a 5 to 7 year basis, they either rise or they fall. That's always the way it's been. It's never really sort of trended sideways over a protracted period, at least not from the levels that we've seen, here more recently. I mean, you did say, for example, see Sydney and Melbourne trend sideways for about 4 or 5 years during the following the 1990s recession, but I would say that given how much demand in the present is driven by investors and speculators, I have a hard time seeing it trending sideways. It's either going to want to go up because they're going to throw some sort of stupid intervention at it, or it's going to want to go down because of, the potential for a recession and challenging economic conditions and rates being higher than the cash rate being higher than 0.1%.
Yeah, excellent. The other thing to watch out for, this anti-money laundering set of regulations, which have been postponed now for many, many years. My understanding is the government is now looking to see whether they will actually implement them. And, there was a report the other day saying there was $1 billion of hot money flowing into the property sector in Australia, which is a big number, right? So if that got turned off, that could actually also give a little bit of a shock to property prices. I tend to agree with you. I think they will either go higher or lower. The chances of them wobbling sideways for 5 or 6 years is almost zero. And just remember, folks, that we are 40% over long-term averages based on income. So, we are in a bubble. That bubble has been created by stupid policies for many, many years. The question is, will they turn them off? Which is exactly the same question, I guess, in China too.
Yeah, except there's actual willingness there to turn them off.
Exactly.
I mean, here in Australia, we can't even agree to limit negative gearing for people, with $10 million worth of property. I mean, yeah. It's kind of absurd, but that's Australia.
Australia, mate.
Yeah, Australia. Okay. This is just a good chart that is actually referencing that Kenneth Rogoff report that I was referring to before, that, basically the Chinese property, and a few eagle-eyed viewers will note that I had this in last week, but I think it's worth revisiting for people who may have missed it, that basically the Chinese property sector today is as reliant, the Chinese economy today is as reliant on property as Spain's was just prior to the financial crisis. And we all know how well that ended.
Now, let me just make the point that, interestingly, Australia is not appearing on that chart, right? So interesting to speculate where Australia would fit. And, a quick rule of thumb would suggest we'd be actually somewhere close to where China is in terms of the dependence on real estate.
That depends who you ask. If you ask the Property Council of Australia, north of 13% of Australia's GDP stems from property and real estate. And then if you ask other people, construction is somewhere between 9 and 11% of GDP. So that puts Australia somewhere between sort of 22 and 24%. So somewhere between, 1/4 to halfway to where China is. So yeah, but I mean, a whole lot higher than places like the US or, South Korea or the Netherlands and places like that anyway.
Yeah, and I'll just make another point that if you look at the proportion of lending to property in Australia relative to China, actually, we've got more lending as a proportion of total lending going to property than China does.
Well, the interesting thing about China is because they are prolific savers and because the one-child policy basically funnels family wealth, down to, the person at the bottom who is buying the home, Chinese household debt to GDP is actually almost half of what Australia's is. So that I think is quite an interesting little factoid.
It is. It shows how much more leveraged we are, right? And that, of course, is also consequential given that interest rates are now much higher than they were and the mortgage cliff is still working through and all of those things. So, and by the way, post bar on that as well, deflation is happening in China. Interest rates are going down. Inflation is happening in Australia. Interest rates is going up.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. Now, this chart from ANZ I think is a good one because it just shows that that the peak of Chinese steel demand is very much in the rearview mirror, and also just that how much steel China is making, even for things like infrastructure. So Chinese steel making for infrastructure is currently roughly double what it was in 2010, even though 2010 was part of the big infrastructure push to build, high-speed rail lines, to build, to build things like the Three Gorges Dam, all manner, huge numbers of airports, you name it, they built it. And I just think it goes to show that I don't think it's sustainable in the long term, because there's not a business case for a lot of this infrastructure. And I think it also just nice to show as well that what proportion of Chinese steel relies on property and infrastructure rather than, say, for example, building cars or trains, which is in the green at the top there. Roughly more than half of Chinese steel production is reliant on those two things. So you're reliant on either the property sector or the government spending shed loads of money on building infrastructure. So it's once again, to quote you on Australia, it is a narrow base.
Indeed. Wow, that shows you the significant. I always have this sort of sense of plate spinning in China, right? They're trying to keep all the plates spinning, but it feels to me as though those plates are beginning to wobble a little bit.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think the thing is that they're actually okay with a bit of plate wobble. And I mean, there is a scenario in which they panic and they try and reignite the bubble, but I'm not even sure how successful that would be without some sort of, I don't know, they could probably ring up Albo or ScoMo and see if they could come up with some sort of strategy for them. I'm sure they'd be willing to for the right price.
Oh, we want to vote on Aboriginal or the equivalent in China, something to deflect from the critical issues, right?
Well, I was thinking more along the lines of, this negative gearing thing. I've heard good things, capital gains tax discounts. We should consider those things. And what's this? Give your banks money to write low fixed rate loans. Oh, well, that's something we should really think about.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's always plenty of levers. Just help yourself to the Australian toolbox and look what happens.
Well, exactly, and it's not like plenty of Australian ministers haven't gone off and worked for Chinese companies for 6 and 7 figure paydays.
Exactly right. Has been known, hasn't it?
Indeed. Now, this I think is a good companion for the previous chart, because it shows that local government, who is basically the biggest spender on infrastructure. So in local government debt, there you've got the yellow, which is local government financing vehicles, which is basically the things they use to buy land for themselves or to take on additional off-balance sheet debt. Then there's the local debt and local government themselves. So the Chinese central government in Beijing doesn't actually have that much debt on its books officially. But in terms of local government, who is the one who has been doing the big spending on all these infrastructure projects over the years, they're really getting to a point where they're reaching not quite their limit, but they're not far away from it. Some I would argue have already reached that limit. You've seen in some provinces in China, you've seen them cut train services, you've seen them cut bus services, you've seen them even cut health services because their budgets are in such a bad way. So I think that illustrates quite nicely with the previous chart that they're not going to be able to keep turning to the infrastructure spending to keep up the steel demand and to keep up the demand for those key Aussie bulk commodities in the long run.
Absolutely right. And this local government issue is really interesting, right? Because there have been various initiatives and interventions to try and encourage the local governments to do X or not do X, but they're sort of pulling a few strings and trying to see what happens. And we also know, of course, some local governments have actually created entities and then sold, property and debt from one to the other. So there's a lot of financial engineering that goes on at the local level.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. There's been in some cases where 40 to 60% of a land release has been sold to the local government's own financing vehicle, so it can basically just keep going and going and going in perpetuity. And it's just worth noting as well that this is an extremely opaque thing, and this is based on this is based on estimates. So the actual true scale of the problem could be significantly larger than is generally perceived. And it's also worth noting that this is based on as a percentage of GDP, and that's if China's telling the truth about its GDP figures. So, that's a sort of bit of a black box in both regards to varying degrees.
Yeah, and so the whole question of shadow banking and how shadow banking interfaces with some of this and some of the other stuff is another big open question in China. There's a big question mark about, well, what are the real finances like? And the shadow banking sector, there was some news last week, a couple of entities that were in trouble. So in a way, a lot of the numbers are rubbery and some of the financial flows aren't necessarily being reported. So therefore, you're always sort of building off a relatively narrow base of information.
Yeah, indeed. Now, people have said some people say it doesn't matter if China goes down, India will save us. India will buy all our exports. No. Now, this isn't a dig at India in any way, shape, or form. India is actually very, very self-sufficient. They provide that they are the second largest producer of steel in the world, and they produce the steel themselves. They produce the iron ore themselves. They're very, very self-sufficient. China is not. So, yeah, India is not coming to China's rescue. Sorry, to Australia's rescue if China does have a big, big moment and the big drop in steel demand.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was talking to somebody some years ago about, isn't India the next China? And I said, no, you've got to understand, they've got a different script, a different playbook. It's not anything like, China 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. They're on a different path completely.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, India is a net exporter of iron ore. They import Australian iron ore for the specific grades that they need for very, very specific purposes. So, yeah, and they want to continue to grow that, grow that capability. And we're just going to go on the coking coal issue. Steel production is growing at 5.3%, which is still very, very fast. But coking coal production in India is growing at 17.2%. So it's basically, and the Ministry of Coal in India has come out and said that they want Coal India, which is the largest coal miner on the face of the earth, to raise its coking coal output to 105 million tons a year by the end of the decade. And that basically would mean if steel production were to say roughly static with where it is today, Australian exports of coking coal to India would basically cease to exist.
Yes. So again, more evidence that there isn't an easy next after China for Australia.
No, it's not. And I mean, you're talking about a country that takes 56 million tons worth of Australian coking coal, which is a sizable proportion of the overall total, and they want to rid themselves of their reliance on us. And not only that, but as you see, various steel makers moving towards arc furnaces and stuff like that, and away from the traditional, blast furnaces and coking, fueled by coking coal, and it's going to be quite a bit more challenging in that regard. So it's really, I don't know. It's just interesting just how many things are sort of potentially against us in that regard, and how little that is acknowledged at times, that that the good times are just going to roll forever.
Yeah, well, of course, in the political cycle, they're only talking 2 or 3 years ahead, right, to the next election or whatever it is. Some of these macro trends take a little bit longer to play out, and of course, you always then get the, as we showed earlier on, the nice surprise on the upside when, in fact, the taxes go up for various reasons. So they can then claim, wonderful perception and perfect management of the economy. How everybody does that amazes me. But when you actually look at the real data and hang on a moment, we've been fortunate. But how long does that lucky country mantra continue now is the question, isn't it?
Indeed, and I just think, just on the India subject, is that they are very much pushing for self-sufficiency. They were already pushing for self-sufficiency before the pandemic and before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but that has only intensified that drive within the Indian government, and within politics in India in general, are all sides are very, very committed to this idea of made in India, of self-sufficiency, of producing as much domestically as they can, and not relying on outside parties, as much as humanly possible. And that's a very, very different set of circumstances, as you said before, to this idea that it's fine, India is just China 15 years ago. It's not in any way like China in terms of the way it's evolving that capacity. So it's a much, much more gradual thing, and it's a much, much more self-sufficiency driven thing. So I think that Australia really needs to have a bit of a look in the mirror in that regard.
Yeah, and just one other quick point. Of course, China has the Belt and Road Initiative, which is essentially putting its threads out into various corners of the world, particularly, for example, into Africa, which is partly a geopolitical influence, but also a direct economic influence, right? So they're, as I said earlier on, trying to source alternatives through that Belt and Road Initiative. And I don't think China has the same attitude as India. India's got a very different view of the way that it's going to play its role in the world. So again, I don't believe that we're just saying that India's behind China, following the same path. They're following their own path.
Yeah, and I think to be completely honest with you, it's a highly admirable one and an intelligent one. They are pursuing self-sufficiency and self-reliance in a time of geopolitical instability and at high levels of uncertainty. So, I mean, realistically, that's what we should be doing here in Australia. But, just, doing little things like, I don't know, having enough fuel to last us more than 6 or 7 weeks, it's just a bit too much.
Yeah, well, she'll be right, mate. She'll be right. No props.
That's all right. We can just go to the US and get our oil reserves from them, magically get them back here.
Yes, that's right. Through those wonderfully open shipping lanes and everything else. Yeah, just like in World War II. Exactly.
All those ships just sailed right on through.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, I think it's just worth noting that there are parts of the Chinese economy that are roaring along. Say, for example, the Chinese car industry. It is, as it stands, currently the largest exporter in the world, in 2023, as by the number of cars exported. So I think it's very easy to look at China and go, oh, the economy's tanking, they're stuffed. Parts of the economy are tanking, absolutely. But there are parts of the Chinese economy, as I mentioned before, which, including the automotive sector, that are performing very, very, very well. So this idea that they're just going to turn around and do this big kitchen sink stimulus, that's not what you do when parts of your economy are booming. Especially when you're not just after you've deployed a whole bunch of other projects and a whole bunch of other interventions that you want to see how effective that they are.
Yeah, and it is worth underscoring, at the start of the year, the narrative was going to be that China was going to come out of its COVID lockdown and that they would actually have a huge acceleration of economic growth, etc., whereas the US was going to effectively go into recession and there'd be issues. Now, of course, that's not played out. So China's actually in deflation territory. The US is still quite strong, and the stock markets are still banking on huge stimulus to the Chinese economy to get them out of trouble again like they did in 2008. But your point is dead right. It's not the same this time, right? There are segments of the economy that are actually doing very well, like the auto that you see there, others not. I think the other point is that if you think back to 2008 and what they did then, that was all about property. Well, we've said property is not going to be necessarily a lever this time. And in fact, I think that the property sector in China has got to the point where it's almost impossible to diffuse. It's a huge proportion of the economy. We've got like Evergrande and, Country Gardens in huge difficulty. And so, in a way, just muddling through in China and doing a little bit of stimulus, but not a lot of stimulus, while focusing elsewhere is probably more likely to be the strategy this time.
Yeah, and I think it's realistically probably, the best strategy that they can pursue given their options, because there's not really, I mean, realistically, they know that the property sector is a huge issue. They know it's a time bomb, but they're basically just, frankly, they're making it someone else's problem slowly but surely. They're not, you're basically seeing the slow, the completion of projects, the slow nationalization of the remaining, the remaining capacity of the Chinese property sector, and basically leaving all these other private developers, or not all of them, but a large proportion of them, in the lurch. Now, you're going to have a bunch of bond investors and a bunch of stock investors who are going to be really, really pissed off about that. But this is China we're talking about. They can just tell them to get stuffed. And, we're going to take you to court. Cool. We control the court. You're going to get nothing. Deal with it. And, that's sort of how I see this all playing out in the longer term. That there will be a Chinese property sector. It will be largely state-run. And we've already seen that in in the number of new projects that are actually being deployed onto recently purchased land. They've been overwhelmingly state-owned enterprises. And you just see them, sort of just like lancing the boil, cutting off the private sector that has all this toxic debt, and then just leaving it for someone else to clean up, because they don't have to deal with it if they don't want to. Yeah. I mean, I know that there's going to be a lot of pissed off people, and a lot of people are going to be, I'm never going to invest in China again. But realistically, that's not a death blow. And frankly, people have been getting burned by Chinese bonds and Chinese companies for years now, and people still keep going back.
Well, of course, the argument is it's a huge economy, and therefore we must have, exposure to it. But that isn't necessarily always the right call. And in fact, some of the data I was looking at recently show that there's been net outflows of foreign investment out of China over the last few months because of this uncertainty. Yet, on the other hand, there are many investors still holding in there, believing that the big stimulus will still come. Well, I just wonder whether it will this time.
Well, that's a good place, I think, to end with this final slide. Now, I'll just move that out of the way. Now, this is measures that have been announced by Beijing, the People's Bank of China, or various local governments just in the past week. They've cut bank reserve ratios, which basically frees up more capital for banks to lend. Now, I don't think this is going to be terribly effective, mostly because the issue isn't credit availability, it's credit demand. Now, unless we see a major change in the Chinese economy, which is admittedly possible, that's not really going to be all that helpful. The People's Bank of China cut mortgage rates for existing mortgage holders for the first time since 2008, as I mentioned previously. The down payment requirements for first home buyers and select property investors has also been cut. So, well, very, very at their version of APRA. Multiple local governments will now treat property investors as first home buyers when it comes to assessing of the mortgages. Central government doubled tax deductions for children's childcare and education, and also raised the tax deduction for supporting the elderly by 15%. And also the People's Bank of China has been doing all it can to help support the Chinese yuan via selling US dollars, via getting exporters to postpone their purchases to basically stop the devaluation of the Chinese yuan. And I think it's just worth noting that if you put a graph of the Chinese yuan and the Australian dollar next to each other, and there is quite a strong correlation at times. And that is something that has really been supporting that intervention by the People's Bank of China, has been something that's been really supporting the Australian dollar in the last couple of weeks. And I think if it wasn't there, and there wasn't this idea that Chinese stimulus was just around the corner, we may be looking at an Australian dollar with a 50 handle rather than a 61.
Yeah, I agree. But those measures, if you actually sort of go down the list, right, they're all sort of, nibbling around the edge of the problem, but they're not necessarily of a quantum as 2008, nor indeed will necessarily solve the problem, because they're sort of nibbling around the edge of the property sector, right? But as you said, if there's less demand, simply because people don't want to buy, and remember that people quite have high savings in China, then you've got to say this is perhaps more window dressing rather than actually serious attempts to solve the problem.
Yeah, I see it as sort of like this is their version of in some ways, a consumer focused
No.
stimulus because they don't want to do a large scale, normal, Western style, let's throw money at households because they don't like the connotations attached to it. And for those of you who may not be aware, China had a very, very bad hyperinflation episode in the mid 1940s during the middle of the Chinese Civil War. And that really scarred the mindset of Chinese policymakers around inflation. They fear it, they do not like it, and they do not want to risk it. And I think this is really, sort of their attempt at just going, you know what, there are parts of the economy that are doing very, very well. That really doesn't need our attention. That's going to keep on keeping on without us getting involved. But this is sort of their attempt, and I think we're going to see more along these lines. Maybe tax cuts for small businesses or tax credits for small businesses for, other, for various purchases and stuff. You've already seen some of that to a degree for transitioning to electric vehicles. But I think we're going to see more of this type of thing. And then we're going to see Beijing sit back and go, okay, give it 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. Let's assess what have we accomplished. Has this been successful? But I think the big takeaway from all that is that you don't do all these things and then and I don't doubt there's going to be more along these lines, and then throw the kitchen sink at it.
No.
You wait and see what happens. So I think that's the people expecting the big stimulus soon are going to be disappointed in that regard, unless, of course, the wheels absolutely fall off and they're not really given much choice.
Right, but what are then the consequences for Australia? Because effectively we showed how leveraged Australia is to, the steel and the coal, and how China is by far one of our biggest trading partners. None of the things that those stimulus levers would necessarily have a huge impact positively, which suggests that, well, what's the level of exposure that Australia's got? It seems to me quite high.
Extremely high. That's the problem. The problem is that if these stimulus measures are reasonably effective, not even, let's even say like decently effective in sort of somewhat stemming the decline in elements of the Chinese economy, then they're not going to need to do these other construction or property focused levels of stimulus, which leaves us in a really, really bad spot because it means the Chinese property sector is going to continue to decline. The ability of Chinese local government to borrow is going to, continue to be put under greater and greater levels of pressure. So unless that paradigm changes, the outlook for the Australian bulk commodities is a very, very challenging one. So, I think that's really, the big takeaway in all of this is that the Chinese economy doing okay is in some ways the worst case scenario for Australia, because then they don't need to do pull the traditional levers that make the money rain from the sky in our little corner of the world.
Yeah, and like I said at the start, a lot of people internationally look at Australia as a proxy for investing in China. And as I said, they're actually perhaps looking to invest in China less than more. And you wonder whether, in fact, that will then flow into Australia, and whether, in fact, Australia will also be seen as a bit of a question mark against it, simply because of our leverage to China. And in the context of higher than expected inflation, high interest rates, the exposure in Australia to property and all of the things there, and the narrow base of the economy in Australia, you have to say, I think that the next few weeks and months could be a bit drafty.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting because we're sort of stuck in this worst case scenario at the moment. Perhaps not worst case, but sort of worst reasonable. The sky isn't falling, and there isn't like another GFC type scenario. Because the US economy is still decently strong enough for the time being. Now, that may change, but as things stand today, it's strong enough to, there's still, at last count, around a 60% chance of another rate hike from the Fed in November. So that's keeping continued pressure on the Australian dollar. It's keeping continued pressure on the RBA to keep at least somewhat hawkish and keep the door open for more rate rises. Whether or not they actually end up pulling the trigger is another matter. But then you've also got the weakening China story on the other side of things, which is also putting downward pressure on the Australian dollar and, creating concerns about the viability of Australia's economic model. But I think one of the things that is going to be interesting going forward is how much the market differentiates between Australia's actual economic fortunes and its perceived economic fortunes in terms of its impact on the Australian currency going forward. Because it may, the market may perceive things as not as bad as they actually are, whereas in reality it might be quite a bit more challenging because the market's the market. It doesn't necessarily reflect, the reality of things.
Well, the market, of course, is based on megatons of hopium, and of course, trying to predict what's going to happen next, rather than actually looking necessarily at the data as it comes in. I always think that the problem with, actually the bond market gives you probably a better indication of where things might be rather than actually some of the other markets. But, I think it's a really interesting topic that we've explored today, Tarric. So thanks for all that work putting it together. And I think the takeaway is that, again, Australia's economic trajectory is looking a bit bumpy, certainly over the next little while. But I wouldn't expect the China stimulus, massive stimulus, to come through and save us. Maybe we have to start thinking of alternative strategies, but that means the politicians need to get off their high horses and go figure. They won't, but they should.
Yeah, well, maybe, they could turn around and go, well, maybe we should think about something that isn't just relying on the wealth effect and housing prices and all those different things to power the consumer economy. And maybe, we could think about, I don't know, something revolutionary, like getting, people who are generally of more working age to have cash in their pockets to consume and create businesses and all that sort of thing. But that's crazy talk.
It certainly is for Australia. Tarric, thank you very much for your time today. As always, greatly appreciated. And I'll look forward to doing it again down the track. And I'm sure we will find another set of charts, another set of issues to explore, because there's always stuff to talk about, isn't there?
Most certainly, mate. We only covered 2 countries in the world basically this week, so there's another 192 or whatever it is.
Yep. Okay. Well, next time we'll find something else to explore. And folks, if you've got specific questions you'd like us to explore, feel free to put them in the chat or contact us via Twitter. And we're always very keen to get feedback and direction in terms of what you'd like to explore, because what we try to do here is to go into a little bit more detail and to try and paint some of those contextual issues so that people get a better sense of what's really going on. Tarric, thanks very much. Have a good weekend and look forward to next time.
Same to you, mate. Looking forward to it.
Cheers. Take care.
Bye.